We got an update now on the story in the about the Washington Post, actually from NPR, saying that more than 200,000 people end up canceling their digital subscriptions to the Washington Post following the paper's decision, which, of course, is owned by Jeff Bezos, to block an endorsement of Vice President Harris for president. It's about 8% of the paper's paid circulation. This was according to people who were briefed on this that told NPR this. In an opinion piece that's got a lot of people talking this morning that was posted last night, Jeff Bezos saying that presidential endorsements do nothing, he says, to tip the scales of an election. Rather, he said they create a perception of bias and non-independence. He said the decision not to endorse a candidate was a step in the right direction to regain Americans' lost trust in the news media. He did acknowledge that the late timing was not ideal, commenting that it was, in his words, because of inadequate planning and not some intentional strategy. In the essay, Bezos talks about his other business interests, writing, "When it comes to the appearance of a conflict, I am not an ideal owner of the Post." He notes his companies, of course, including Amazon and Blue Origin, often interact with government officials. He writes, quote, "You can see my wealth and business interests as a bulwark against intimidation, or you can see them as a web of conflicting interests. Only my own principles can tip the balance from one to the other. I assure you that my views here are, in fact, principled, and I believe my track record as owner of the Post since 2013 backs this up." 3 members of the paper's editorial board have resigned in protest after the decision, though my understanding is they are still employees of the Post. Interestingly, they're just not on the quote-unquote board of editorial board itself. Our next guest is going to join us to talk about the Washington Post story, about McDonald's moves to try to right the ship after the recent E. coli outbreak, and so much more. I want to welcome crisis management expert Eric Dezenhall, chairman of Dezenhall Resources. Good morning to you. Curious both about your reaction to the Post. Also, the LA Times made a similar decision not to endorse a candidate this time around. There's been obviously a lot of blowback. Folks apparently canceling subscriptions and the like. And then, of course, now we've heard from Jeff Bezos himself last evening. What say you?
It's really too soon to tell. I mean, we're right in the middle of an election where there is such high emotions and fever pitch that every single thing that breaks seems to be the eternal crisis. But, you know, the issue in the media industry is so large that I suspect that this will move out of the news pretty quickly, because we're in for a bloodbath in a few days. And I think that is going to consume the public. And I think in most crisis situations, what comes down to is what you're competing with. And I think that the media, the Post, the LA Times, are competing with something much larger than a debate about journalism, given what's about to happen.
And that bloodbath is a result of what?
The election. I mean, I think that this is not going to be easily resolved. I mean, I think that what's fascinating to me from a crisis management perspective about Trump is that what goes around never comes around, not even a little bit. I mean, you would have thought that the rally at Madison Square Garden would, in any other time, would have been a career killer, a campaign killer. That doesn't seem to be the case. And I think that that's sucking up all the oxygen. And a lot of what I look at when we are in a crisis situation is, what are we competing with? And I think when you're competing with the election, everything else falls by the wayside pretty quickly, unless, of course, you're a McDonald's consumer and you're worried about lunch.
I want to get to McDonald's, but let me just ask this. Do you see these moves by the LA Times, by the Washington Post? Look, there's two views of this. One is that it's a very principled decision that opinion boards, editorial boards should not be endorsing candidates. And then, of course, the question is, if they don't do that, do they actually gain more trust as a function of it? Jeff Bezos made the argument it's at least directionally in the right direction. Or do you see this, as some others do, as capitulation of some sort to former President Trump, fearing that if he wins, there is going to be retaliation?
You know, you can't be responsible for how everybody is going to interpret something. And I think that I, for fun, read the comments on articles, and I was surprised to see that the comments are relatively even in the comments section about the decisions by the LA Times and the Washington Post. Now, I live in Washington, so journalists are understandably outraged. They think that this is the end of the world. I think that consumers are very different. And a lot of times what a lot of the media are having to make a decision about is the kind of consumers they want in the future. And there's a lot of concern about media bias. I think that a lot of that concern is very, very realistic. And so this is one of those things we're going to see over time, whether or not these media outlets end up retaining other people who they might have lost in the short term.
We got to go, Eric, but McDonald's, is there a way back? Easy, hard?
Of course there is. Easy. I mean, in a crisis situation, all people care about is hazard. When you find out that the company has isolated the problem, when you find out that they have pulled the product, that they know exactly what it is, I think that there's a very good chance that sales rebound very, very quickly, because if you look at McDonald's history, they really have had a shockingly small number of cases like this. And when the government comes out and says you're doing all that you can do, I think it's great. They should feel relatively comfortable.